Yes. Welcome everyone to this webinar joint webinar between Xreg and Notabene. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function within Zoom. If you haven't used it before, it's a little button on the bottom right of your Zoom window, and then we will get to answering questions towards the end.
Terrific. Thanks, Pelle. I'll get started. So if I could start by briefly introducing myself, my name is Samtani. I'll be the moderator for today's event. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for VASPnet, the assured source of regulatory reference data on service providers authorized to conduct virtual asset activities. In addition to this, I also serve as technical editor for the Joint Working Group for InterVASP messaging standards, also known as InterVASP, the standards body that brought you the IVMS 101 standard. So on the 28th of October, the global AML watchdog, the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, published their finalized guidance for virtual assets and VASPs, virtual asset service providers. FATF have been moving in a direction of expanding rules that apply to intermediaries that participate in the crypto space. The new guidance looked into self-hosted wallets, which are referred to by FATF as unhosted wallets, decentralized services, peer-to-peer transactions, counterpart VASP due diligence, and of course, the travel rule, the requirement for the exchange of mandated data from originating VASP to beneficiary VASP. The reception of the revised guidance was decidedly mixed. While the final guidance offers some clarity, many believe it remains too vague. It has been argued that the guidance seeks to practically mirror controls placed on traditional financial services, ignoring the strengths of blockchain tooling to assist in combating money laundering and terrorist financing. Some say that the recommendations seek to suppress the blockchain as it was originally envisioned. Further, while this guidance clarifies the recommendation, it is not law, and member countries will implement the recommendations into law with their own nuances, posing further challenges for travel rule adherence, including loss of standardization and complexity in determining one's obligations. So while several countries have already got in place regulatory regimes to oversee virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, these countries remain in the minority. Even fewer have implemented the travel rule for virtual assets, and of those, many still apply forbearance until there are viable technological solutions to meet their requirements. However, what we see today is that this is a one-way street and the clock is ticking towards compliance. Today, we're hosting not just another FATF webinar. Our expert panel will be providing their insights into the implications of the updated guidance, their reading into the updated guidance, interoperability of travel rule solutions, the importance of counterpart VASP due diligence, and more. And if our prep call was anything to go by, we're going to have a fantastic session today. So we're very fortunate to have our expert panel joining us today. We have Siân Jones, who's the senior partner at Xreg Consulting. Siân's extensive experience in policy formulation and regulatory development is leveraged by governments, public authorities, and crypto asset businesses around the world. She has a wealth of experience and, among other achievements, architected Gibraltar's DLT regulatory framework and served as technical expert on FATF's policy development group dealing with virtual assets and VASPs. She also served as and serves as convener for the Joint Working Group for InterVASP messaging standards. We also have joining us today Pelle Brændgaard, who's the CEO and co-founder at Notabene, a leading travel rule solution provider. Pelle was previously co-founder and head of Uport, the storied and pioneering identity platform launched on Ethereum. As an early member of the financial crypto community, Pelle built pre-blockchain crypto platforms and has worked in fintech, banking, blockchain, and decentralized identity around the world. And we're fortunate to have today with us Patricia Risso, who is the global head of compliance at Bitso. Patricia started her career at the Financial Services Commission in Gibraltar, and she's been at the forefront of developments in various aspects of business in the fintech space, including digital currency, blockchain, and distributed ledger technologies in Gibraltar. Thank you, Patricia, for joining us today. To kick us off, Siân, I'm going to get you starting the panel. Siân, has the publication of the updated guidance clarified areas of ambiguity from previous guidance, which was one of the criticisms put forward to the FATF on the original guidance?
Well, it's longer. It's about double the length now. So 50, 60 pages are now, I think, 115 or something like that. So has it illuminated? It probably has in some respects, but it's left a lot to be desired. So let's just have a think for a moment about what is the same and what is different, and perhaps see where that takes us. Historically, you're going back 3 years to the point in time when FATF, which, as you mentioned, is the global standard setter. It's a an intergovernmental organization. It isn't a thing in its own right. It doesn't even have a legal identity in its own right. It's a convocation of nations. They get around the table, 39 of them, and they set the rules for the world by agreement, by consensus, for the world to apply anti-money laundering, countering terrorist financing, and also now countering financing of weapons of mass destruction. So the body sits there and it sets those rules that affect a little over I think it's about 205 countries around the world. So countries generally are either direct members of FATF, or they're members of what are known as the FATF-style regional bodies, so the broader network of countries. And you've got a couple of outliers like North Korea and so forth, but broadly speaking, the world finds itself, countries around the world find themselves bound as a sort of condition of membership to implement the standards. But they're standards. They are not, as you rightly say, in and of themselves law. They're recommendations. That's what they're called. There are 40 recommendations, but they're recommendations with consequences. So countries that fail in a series of rounds of what they call mutual evaluation, countries that fail to live up to those standards can find themselves on things like the grey list, which has very significant consequences for that country and that country's financial industry. So countries generally try to comply to these standards as best they can, but they do so at national level and they implement their laws nationally. So 3 years ago, FATF made a small change, a one-sentence change to its standards, recommendation 15, that said essentially that virtual asset service providers are now caught within these standards. So there was nothing about them prior to that. And in order to make that clear, what is meant by a virtual asset service provider, there were 2 new glossary definitions that were added. One was for a virtual asset service provider, or VASP, and the other was for virtual assets themselves, because that definition becomes instrumental in determining who or what a VASP is. Nothing has changed in this new FATF guidance in terms of the standards. But these were one sentence and 2 one-sentence definitions, and these have not changed in the latest guidance. What the guidance sets out to do, and the first version of this is now a little over 2 years old, is to explain, or attempt to explain, what the implications of this minor change is, and how the broader set of 40 recommendations can be applied to this new class of obliged entity, the VASP. The first set of guidance, about 60 pages or thereabouts, was a first stab at it, but it only went so far, and it raised many, many questions, both from industry and from countries that had the job of implementing these standards in national law, and that's still an ongoing process, by the way. The clarifications that have come have been in this new version, this latest version, just adopted a month ago, not even a month ago, I think, sorts out some of the ambiguities. It makes it clear what countries ought to expect from this sector, from VASPs. And in doing so, of course, it sets for VASPs what they ought to be doing. And these things really touch a number of different facets. It makes clear who's in scope, things like stable coins and stablecoin governance bodies, most virtual asset issuers, many peer-to-peer platforms, some matching and finding services, and interestingly, in some cases, developers who are deploying software, apps, and smart contracts, and also, interestingly, those who might receive fees or commissions or spreads or other benefits resulting from those services that are defined as being VASP services, whether that's directly or indirectly. So you might have gains in the future as a result of holding a token for something that for a project that you launched. The fact that you didn't actually get paid to do it and you don't actually operate it doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't a VASP or considered part of a VASP. It's very complicated. To some extent, that's been clarified. What's key to all of this is that repeatedly throughout the guidance, there are terms like these definitions and these interpretations should be taken broadly and expansively, and that has all sorts of connotations for folks. It also makes clear, that some things are outside of scope, things like central bank digital currencies, certain technology service providers like cloud service providers, miners and validators, hardware wallet manufacturers, unhosted wallet software providers. These are now more clearly stated as being outside scope. And also peer-to-peer transactions are explicitly clarified as being, between unhosted wallets being outside. So this is the other side of the coin, if you like, because it was always the case that the rules only apply to VASPs, people who are doing this for a business. And when you look at things like the travel rule, that it only applies where there are VASPs at both ends. So there's been a lot of clarity around that. In relation to the travel rule, there's quite a lot in there that has been expanded, that's been clarified about what originating VASPs need to do in terms of acquiring data, gathering data, what they need to hold, how long they need to hold it for, and what information they need to transfer. It was always there, but it's been sharpened up a little bit to make it easier to understand. And also what the beneficiary VASPs need to do, the data they need to hold, the data they need to evaluate, and the obligations on both VASPs, at both ends, both bookends, if you like, what they have to do in terms of, say, sanctions checking, consistency checking, that the people for whom payment or value is being transferred for their benefit, that they are in fact that VASP's client, and so on and so forth. And there's also some clarity around the relationships between the two VASPs, whether a VASP bookending a transfer, and particularly around the area of counterpart due diligence, that a VASP at one end needs to do due diligence on the VASP at the other end before being satisfied. In other words, to make sure that they are likely to be following these FATF standards in their country before giving effect to those transfers. Now, this is very similar to what happens, of course, in the banking industry. And there's also some clarity around what information needs to be captured when transactions fall below what's known as the de minimis threshold. There are provisions in the rules that say when the value of a transfer falls below $1,000 or euros, that you don't necessarily have to transfer information. However, some countries do require it, and some countries don't need to take that de minimis $1,000 or euros, but can have a lesser amount or even a zero amount. So they can be in a situation where there is no effective de minimis rule. But there are still some obligations on the VASP in terms of finding out who their client is, doing certain due diligence on their customers, and certain information they need to hold and retain should it be required by law enforcement and so on. So a lot there. A lot is clarified. Unfortunately, there are also some things that are still fairly woolly, or as someone on a previous call today put, rather wishy-washy, but we won't talk about that just yet.
That's fantastic, Siân. I do want to circle back to you, especially on a lot of what you said, especially on how wide the net is cast in determining who falls under the category of a VASP and who wouldn't. So I will be going into that later, as well as the topic of meeting the regulatory obligations of your counterpart, so that you know that you're actually transferring the data that they might actually need, and how better to understand who your counterpart is, and at that level of due diligence. But before we move on to that, Pelle, I'd like to move across to you, if that's okay. Now, I know that Notabene have been looking at industry on at a broader level and considering how they are responding to the travel rule. You, Notabene, recently conducted a industry-wide survey on how firms are doing this, how they're actually implementing and responding to the travel rule. Could you walk us through the results of this survey?
Yeah, we've learned quite a lot from it. We're still working through and processing to get, and we will be releasing final survey results very soon, probably in December, early December, I believe. But there were some really interesting learnings in there. One of the things that we learned, for example, which was quite worrying, is that 18% of the respondents had actually suspended all external transactions while they were figuring this out, which for me is a very worrying for the industry, that they have felt that they've had to take such serious steps on this. The other kind of good news, I would say, is that 72% of respondents are already in the process of implementing or are planning on being fully implemented by Q2 at the latest, so Q1, Q2 next year. There's already quite a few people that have implemented it already, and we know that as a travel rule service provider, as an end-to-end provider, we've been helping quite a few companies do that, and there are fair amount of transactions already being processed and being sent between exchanges today. And there are others that have the implementation ready and just figuring out the right time to switch it on. But the good thing is the sunrise issue that we as an industry have seen as being one of the biggest headaches. And the sunrise issue is the period when as the regulation is being implemented around the world, the sunrise issue, it's still a problem. And 56% of VASP see this as like one of the major issues with implementing the travel rule today. But if 72% of the respondents are actually planning on having this implemented by Q1 or Q2, that's a good news, because that means that the sunrise issue is just going to be less of an issue by then, which is not that far. It's not that far away. So I'm very happy to report that.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, it is a concern considering that 18%. However, considering the updated guidance, are you noticing a shift in how firms are looking at meeting their travel rule obligations, priorities, or are you seeing that it's pretty much as it was prior to the updated guidance being published? Have you seen a shift in behavior?
Yeah, I think people are taking it a lot more serious now. I mean, there's urgency coming from different national regulators, but actually, even more so than the updated regulation, the updated guidance, I should say, because it is not regulation for sure. But one thing that we're seeing is that major counterparties' timelines for implementation actually, in many cases, drive implementation much more so than your own national regulator. Because one of the things to understand with the travel rule is that it's not just your regulator you have to think about. You have to think about the regulator of your primary counterparties. So for that, we're seeing there's a lot of urgency around getting online with the travel rule now, so you can continue to perform transactions with South Korea, for example, who are where I believe they have to be online by March in South Korea, if I'm not mistaken there. So a lot of exchanges are actually implementing it way ahead of their own national regulators to be able to continue that traffic flow there. I do think that, like, on the travel rule aspect of it, again, we can always get into the pros and cons of the travel rule. I think, and as Siân was saying, there's not really a lot of major changes to it. It's more really spelling things out, things that were less clear, things where there was a lot of confusion on. And I think there's been some improvements on the due diligence aspect of VASP, for example, where it's a lot more operational. And I think it's great that FATF has heard a lot of the feedback from us and from GDF and from Xreg and others on the difficulties of doing this. So it's a much more practical version of it than maybe in prior occasions of it. But it's still a very important aspect of the travel rule, of course, that has to be thought through.
Of course. And it's very interesting that you point out you don't have to wait. As a VASP, you wouldn't have to wait until it's law, until the travel rules is implemented as local law, but rather your counterpart may require this information from you, and you have to meet the obligation in order to continue to do business and continue to transfer value with your counterpart VASP, which is very interesting.
And I'll say the majority of our customers, that's the case for them right now.
It also works the other way around, of course, where you can be at the receiving end, you're the beneficiary end, and find that data that you're required to receive from an originating VASP isn't being presented, possibly because that VASP isn't yet required to do it. And what do you do then with receiving? So it works both ways around. Okay, it takes two to tango in the travel rule, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
I suppose it does pose the question as well. If data ends up coming to you as a beneficiary institution, a beneficiary VASP, what are you meant to do with that data if there is no legal obligation to keep hold of that? Would you be in breach of, say, data compliance rules, data privacy rules, if you were to be transmitted that data without actually requiring to receive it? So that's an interesting discussion in itself. Very good. Thank you, Pelle. Patricia, if I could move on to you. Now, Bitso itself is a large VASP, and you have been taking your travel rule obligation seriously over the course of the last few months, perhaps longer. What I was keen to ask you is about your implementation of the travel rule in your experience. Do you feel like the travel rule as it stands today may have an impact on your users and could potentially impact your business?
It's a great question and a very relevant question, Neil. So I have to say that I'll start how it will impact the business, the travel rule. At the end of the day, we all know, anybody that's listening and is already a VASP, on the expense we have already spent. I spent a lot of my personal time speaking to a lot of providers, associations that were creating a travel rule compliance solution, for example. So, and the thing we do impact to our technical operational capability and the time that you need to implement the travel rule. So from a business perspective, it's going to hurt in terms of time, in terms of how you can deliver, and in terms of the sign up with. So for example, it's public record. We've signed up with Notabene, and I'm very thankful for that. It's making my life a lot easier. But also, one of our main concerns from a business perspective is the data that you're going to be receiving as well. So we will have our home jurisdiction, Bitso, for those in the call that don't know, are regulated in Gibraltar. So the regulation was set out quite a while back, and we're due to, we have to adhere to the regulation by June 2022. And so one of the things that we need to ensure is that not only do we align ourselves to the data requirements from our home jurisdiction, but other jurisdictions. What you don't want is, for example, this is where the inconsistencies in my mind still arise. FATF saying ID, address, or account number makes it a little bit difficult, because a jurisdiction that might have a draconian view might say you need ID, you need address, and so forth. And that creates the inconsistencies and the friction. And this is what, from a VASP perspective, we're concerned about, from the practicalities of implementing and the friction within the ecosystem. Also, thing that we are concerned about, and I'm hugely, it's like everything, is our queuing system. Those VASPs that have not implemented the travel rule, and you have an incoming transaction and you think, okay, it goes to the high risk, and the queuing system is going to increase exponentially, which means manual interaction, which means, do you have the risk appetite to accept it? You know, what do you do? Have they had time? Does their home jurisdiction not require them, like South Korea? It's March, Gibraltar's June, and so forth. So a lot of VASPs are also sitting on the fence, and you know, in terms of the implementation, when do you go live? Do you wait for the bigger exchanges? Bitso is a big exchange, but in terms of volume, we're not. So we are waiting for those VASPs that we all interact with, which are potentially bigger in volume and transaction, to adopt it, because what you don't want is to create a lot of friction for your users. So you've got to wait as well for the right time, but obviously you do have that definitive red line set by the, for example, the Gibraltar Financial Services Commission. So also, one of the things that we need to understand is how this impacts our users. And this is where I think that the FATF is great, and I can understand what it's trying to achieve in terms of transparency, in terms of AML, CTF, PF. It's, you know, that's the positive side. But in terms of the users, we have day-to-day issues with users getting to send assets just to a simple unhosted wallet and the address, and they get it wrong. So adding to the mixture beneficiary details increases user friction. And so we're going to have, and this is the implication, the marketing team, the content team, to educate our users what we need from them. This is going to be critical when you're dealing with a retail mass market, a VASP, such as Bitso. You know, we are worried about our average user that might not have the awareness, you know, and understanding of the implications of the travel rule. So it's our, you know, we have to educate our users, and it will cause friction, and it will hurt our users to a certain extent at the beginning, because it's like teething issues. It happened with Swift in the good old days. Siân might remember. I definitely do remember. So, so all these things, and you know, there's the negatives of it, but also the positive, because from a user perspective, it gives our users confidence as well in terms of what we're trying to achieve as an ecosystem. And at the end of the day, it's about financial inclusion, but VASP want to be financially included as well, and make sure that we are aligned and not just criticized by the rest of the financial services sector in terms of, you know, how we're going forward to mitigate those anti-money money laundering risks and terrorist financing risks and proliferation financing. Oh my God, what a mouthful! Eventually, I'm going to have more letters to it. So, in terms of positives as well, I think you asked me, or I think it was Neil, I'm not sure whether it's Siân and Neil during our initial prep. So, what are the competitive advantages, you know, of the travel rule? When it you know, was first rolled out, no, you naturally think, oh my God, what are they? You know, so, but it's becoming very evident. The FATF, the travel rule, is here to stay. Either you embrace it or you don't. And if you don't embrace it, you don't have a place within the VASP ecosystem. You have to adhere to it. Those that don't will be phased out because they won't be able to interact in the ecosystem. So it's very evident, and Bitso, I have to say, that has always leveraged on taking that step forward in terms of adhering to requirements, international standards, you know, regulation, and using it, leveraging on it at the end of the day. But this is going to be the case that whoever doesn't roll it out will suffer the consequences later down the line, because VASPs, other regulated VASP, other registered VASP in their own home jurisdiction, will not be able to interact. I think that the FATF will probably clarify a little bit more, because one of the things that we want to know is it the case that eventually you have to stop interacting with these VASPs and they get left out. But anyway, I don't want to take too much time. So
no, Patricia, that was so many good points and so much that we could unpack if we had the time. I do want to circle back on something you had talked about: friction and specifically the differences in regimes as they're rolled out across the world. We talked briefly about the sunrise effect, and we know that we have standards efforts and various protocols that are being introduced to attempt to ease that friction and make that journey a little bit easier. And I'll be bringing that up as we move forward. But before we talk about that, I want to just head back to you, Siân, and I want to pose a question. So as a service provider that offers virtual asset services, how would I know whether the travel rule applies to me in accordance to the recommendations and the guidance presented as it stands today?
It's actually a really good question, because it's something that the revised guidance tries to help. When you look at the obvious definition, it says essentially, I'll read it to you. It says, it's very short: any natural or legal person, so there's an individual or a company, not covered elsewhere in the recommendation, so you're not an obliged entity by some other means, like a bank, for example, that conducts as a business one or more of 5 defined activities on behalf of another natural or legal person. Now, it sounds quite simple and quite straightforward, and yet it's fraught with all sorts of difficulties. The notion that you're an entity that provides as a business, so not in your personal, say, investment capacity, but if you make a business of doing this thing, then you're tick number one. Secondly, are you performing one of the 5 defined activities? They include the obvious ones: fiat to crypto exchange, crypto to crypto exchange, some other involvement in the transfer of assets or custody of assets, crypto assets. So they're fairly straightforward and easily understood concepts. So you either are or you aren't doing one of those things as a business, right? Another tick. And then, are you doing it on behalf of another natural or legal person? And this is sometimes quite challenging, because people think, well, that means you must be some kind of agent or be given some authority to do it by someone. But actually, it's wider than that. So the definition of whether you're a financial institution in other parts of the recommendations. So, are you a bank, for example, for AML? Yeah. You could say, well, if you transfer money over, say, SWIFT or some other payment rails, you transfer it to the benefit of somebody else somewhere else. Are you actually, is that a fiduciary role, or are you simply being instructed to make a payment? Are you actually doing it on behalf of someone else, or are you a good, even better example, if you're the receiving bank, are you doing it on behalf of somebody else, right? You've got no, if you like, you've not been mandated, you've not been contracted to do it. However, FATF takes a very wide, very expansive view of that as well. So in other words, if you're effectively facilitating that transfer for the benefit of somebody else, then you're caught. So the same kind of things apply. That's very simple and straightforward. And then you come to DeFi. You say, well, the whole essence of DeFi is it's decentralized. There isn't a centralized body or entity performing that role. Now, forgetting for a moment, and the new guidance says something about this, don't ignore labels, right? Just because you call yourself a decentralized, say a DEX, for example, decentralized exchange, doesn't matter what you call yourself. It's what is really going on under the hood that counts. So let's just say that there's a body of what's called decentralized evaporates, because actually it's not really decentralized. But you've got many projects, of course, that are decentralized. And then, well, if it's decentralized, you're not a natural or legal person, performing these activities. But now in applying this expansive approach, the new guidance says that these are the kinds of things that countries and therefore regulators in those countries need to look at. And you need to look at, are you a software developer? Well, if all you're doing is, being paid a salary to write some software, you're almost certainly not in scope. But if you're paid in the underlying token, right, there's some native token to that particular DeFi arrangement, and that you're paid in it because you hope it'll be successful, and at some point in the future you'll make potentially a capital gain, and you'll reap your rewards for having put all that software development effort in at the beginning. You're not actually taking fees or commissions in the traditional sense, but you're benefiting from it, or have the possible future benefit from this venture as a result of your software development effort. And so the guidance says you might well be a VASP. And so as we touch into DeFi, there's an awful lot of wishy-washiness in the text, which makes it pretty difficult to see from a FATF perspective, remember a standards perspective, what's what, and you're going to have to rely on the regulators and the national law in the place where you are. So if I'm sitting in a chair here, somewhere anchored in a storm in Spain, and if I were a software developer working on a DeFi project and keeping some tokens for myself for the future, I would probably be concerned about the Spanish regulator's interpretation of whether or not I'm a VASP. So it is both clear, but the edge cases, an increasing number of edge cases, are actually becoming more complex. And that's before I even start talking about NFTs and whether NFTs are virtual assets, and therefore if I'm developing an NFT, you get the drift. It's a complicated.
That will be for episode 7 of our series of webinars on the travel rule, I think. And of course, wishy-washy is the technical term for ambiguity.
I say it how it is. Forget the technical.
Fantastic. No, that's great. And thank you for offering that clarity on the point on DeFi, which was, of course, going to be my next question on the subject. Pelle, over to you. But actually, before I do that, very briefly, I just want to remind everyone that that we are taking questions. We will reserve some time at the end of our session to answer the question. Our panelists will be answering those questions. Please do keep them coming. Pelle, we've seen evolve since the clarification by FATF on the inclusion of virtual asset service providers into their 40 recommendations, a thriving ecosystem of travel rule solution providers, protocols, and standards bodies and work. Could you give us a brief overview of those and how we can tell the difference between these various components in the ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks. So there are. It's an interesting standards ecosystem right now. I've been involved in standards for a long time, and there are, I think, probably at least 6 potential protocols at the moment. And there are various different ways that people have started, attacking travel rule, when they build protocols. Some of the protocols are very similar, and some of them have very fundamentally different aspects to it. I think one of the problems with, in general, with the protocols is that very few of them are actually live yet. And I think we should look at some of the core reasons why this is true. And I think one of the real issues is that many of these protocols were designed very often by technical people. I mean, technical people design technical protocols, and that's fine, but they were very often designed probably a little bit too early before we knew and understood all the operational challenges in implementing the travel rule. There are a couple of very open protocols. So TRP and Open VASP are 2 protocols that we like because they've taken a very, very open approach. And I'm glad to see that they're actually starting to merge now. So that's really good that we are having rather than having more protocols, I always think it's great. Let's have fewer protocols and fewer things to implement. But there's still differences between them. One other concerning aspect of several protocols is that they have often taken kind of a similar approach to VASP identification that you might see in traditional banking systems, which means that there is a membership or some kind of gatekeeper who decides who can use this protocol or not. And I think this is a particular concerning trend, particularly because we come from this industry that was designed to be open, that designed to be permissionless, as Patricia mentioned. And it's very important that the travel rule doesn't go in and change this from a permissionless industry and technology to a permissioned gated technology. And I think it's very important that we look at that. So I don't necessarily want to go in and call out specific protocols on this, but it is definitely an issue with some protocols. And we're trying to push solutions outside of the protocols together with Xreg, for example, with the integration of the VASPnet service that Xreg offers to really bring data in, give VASPs the decisions to be able to figure out who they want to interact with. And there's a very important distinction here. Most of the regulators we speak to, they say when it comes to the travel rule, it's your responsibility to perform the due diligence on the counterparty VASP. So you can't really outsource it to a network or to a service provider. You can't outsource that decision process to us at Notabene, for example, but we can help you provide the tools to do so. So this is the approach that we're doing where you decide who you want to interact with. And this is very important because we're not just a group, this is not an industry of 10 large exchanges. There's a whole bunch of many different kinds of institutions, whether it's fiat on-ramps, whether it's different kinds of custodial service providers, whether it's liquidity providers. There's so many different kinds of institutions, and we need to be open to allow the industry continue to interact and transact with them. Also, one thing to also point out, there are a lot of very, very good, well-run exchanges in jurisdictions where there isn't any, virtual assets guidance, or any actual regulation yet surrounding virtual, VASP registration or anything like that. And I think it would be a real shame if the industry just cuts off access to these exchanges who've been a core part of our industry over the last 5 years, have built up really, really good compliance teams, compliance programs. And that the great thing about and Siân probably has an opinion about this as well, but the great thing about the updated recommendation is that FATF specifically calls this out as an issue and allows people to go in and create their own due diligence on these VASPs and have their own agreements with the VASPs, regardless whether they are regulated by someone or not. So I think that's actually a really good outcome of the guidelines, is that they are really encouraging the industry to be open about this. And that's also what we're trying to do as part of our travel rule solution, is really help the industry continue to be open.
No, that's brilliant, Pelle. Thank you. I like your point where it doesn't have to be binary, whereas in order to participate in a transfer of value with another VASP, they simply have to be regulated. If they're not, then you simply are not permitted to conduct business with them. Rather, you have to make a risk-based decision, taking a number of different factors into consideration. And of course, part of the data that you can use is data sourced from VASPnet. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Just conscious of time, I want to move on now. Patricia, a question for you, and the final question to the panelists from myself before we move on to questions and answers. Patricia, in your experiences, and you touched on this, but I would like a little bit, maybe we could go into a little bit more detail on the subject. Could you tell me some of the challenges that you faced and your organization has faced in implementing the travel rule, both from a technical, we've discussed the use of Notabene to assist you with this, but also from the operational side and compliance side?
Well, it's always challenging when something gets rolled out at the very beginning, because you've got the key stakeholders of the business saying, okay, how we're going to do this, how is this going to affect our users? From a compliance perspective, you know, the travel rule at the end of the day, from most of the team, we come from either a banking or an e-money kind of background, so it just made sense to us. So the travel rule is something that we were very used to as a department. Now the challenges of rolling it out was another thing. One of the things that we did do is spend you know, I think 18 months talking, since the travel rule and the discussions were being held, going to different providers. And I just want to touch on something that Pelle said, because I've been in some horrendous meetings about specific protocols that weren't agnostic and were membership based. And I famously went to a meeting where I was told, well, you're an international Mexican-based exchange, so in 18 months you can come back to us and we may make a decision to allow you into a membership. And I thought, I'm in breach in 18 months time. So that blew them out of the water. And what we wanted, and this is what the industry is craving for, is that agnostic solution that allows all of us to interact. This is not about exclusion, it's about inclusion, and that's not the point of the ecosystem. So that was something that the founders of Bitso had the forefront thinking, you know, especially our CTO saying, look, this is an ecosystem that we're supposed to interact and help, by all means meet requirements, but let's do this smartly. And and we wanted to shift the organization, and we wanted to shift the industry from going down a Swift solution. And I think that there was a big bunch of us trying to shift that full process, but there are elements in different jurisdictions where that's still being developed. They haven't come up with a product, so that was a challenge. Going to a lot of meetings and everybody, nobody had a beta version, so just a wire chart, to be quite honest. So it has represented challenges. The challenge is who do you pin your flags to? Who are you going to pin those flags on which mast? And that is a decision that we took very quickly when we first met Pelle, because it was when we sat there, I'm thinking this ticks every single box. Now, from a compliance perspective, and anybody out there as well, is compliance teams are not formed of techies or engineers. They're formed of compliance analysts, people that may not necessarily have that skill set. And we needed a solution, for example, that was user-friendly and allowed us to be efficient as an organization. And I think that, with Notabene, we made the correct decision. I hope so. But and to be quite honest, it was a huge relief on all of us, because we were just going around. There were so many solutions out there with so many restrictions, and then waiting for the bigger exchanges to make those rumblings, which they now have as well. So it's a question of what's going to happen. I believe that from my perspective, and this is my personal opinion, we're going to be testing for a while. And a while until we get to that critical mark, to wait for those bigger exchanges, and also to test it to make sure that we don't burden the ultimate user. At the end of the day, what we want to ensure is that our users get used to making not mandatory at the beginning, but having a process where you make it optional and then get the user base used to it. So this is kind of the trajectory that we want to follow, and also meeting that regulatory red line in June 2022.
Fantastic. Patricia, that was a wonderful answer. So many great points, and a great point at which we can pause and then and move on to field questions from our audience. Panelists, thank you very much for fielding my questions. I appreciate it, and I think this has been incredibly valuable. So if I could start off very quickly, we have a question from Clement, who's asked, how do you deal with wallets or crypto exchanges that don't adopt the travel rule, which is required in your jurisdiction? What would the steps be then? And perhaps I can pose this question. If there's anyone who wishes to answer the question, by all means. No? Pelle, why don't you help us out with this one?
Yeah, it's it's a very tricky one, right? It's a very tricky thing, and you have to make some decisions. There's no clear, simple answers for this right now. There's some work that we're doing in the protocols with various protocols to kind of eliminate this as being an issue. But right now, if your customers have deposit addresses, exposed, you will be receiving transactions from non-compliant exchanges or unhosted wallets of some sort, and you don't necessarily know who's behind that. So the question is, how do you deal with this until the better solutions are out there to handle this? And I mean, what do you send the funds back? It is a difficult thing. I think I'd almost actually, I don't think anyone has any real answers to this, but the whole idea of the travel rule is to eliminate this particular issue as well. I mean, technically it's not there yet, but Siân, perhaps you have with your regulator hat on and knowledge of the industry, what should we all do in these cases?
Follow a risk-based approach is what any regulator would say, which is a nice wishy-washy way of saying you just have to make up your mind as to what the risks are, so long as you can, if you've got those, if the decision is logical, if the decision is documented, you can prove to your regulator or to others that you have taken that risk-based approach. You've met broadly speaking, you've met your obligations, whether or not it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, with the benefit of hindsight. But perhaps two quick things to point out here. Firstly, the travel rule only applies where there is a VASP at both ends of a transaction. So a VASP to unhosted wallet, or a VASP to a non-VASP or non-obliged entity, because you could also have other obliged entities such as banks at the other end, and vice versa. Those are those are the only things only situations where the travel rule bites. So outside of that, you don't have to worry about it. You have other kinds of decisions to make. And some countries have been very specific about this. So there are quite separately different countries who have taken shall we say, a very robust approach to receiving or making value transfers to unhosted wallets, and requiring VASPs to undertake due diligence as if the unhosted wallet at the other end was indeed your own customer of yours. So there are issues around that, but there's nothing in the FATF recommendation that directly requires that, beyond the requirement for countries to themselves look at the risks of these things and make decisions at national level as to what they expect of the industry in their country. So, something that is seen as standardizing, a global approach, actually is going to throw up hundreds, probably thousands of permutations. If you think of travel rule has, 200 from 200 countries at one end to 200 countries at the other end, you end up with, what is that, 4,000 permutations alone, if I can do math still. So you've got lots of situations there that may or may not fit, but it only applies to crypto transfers. Now, the sunrise issue, which someone else has asked about, and that Pelle referred to earlier on today, that is the issue where countries are implementing these standards, and particularly their requirements around the travel rule, at different timelines. They're not all cutting in and biting in every country at the same time. In fact, it'll probably take 5, 6, 7 years before the last country ends up implementing the travel rule. Today, less than half have implemented the travel rule, and those that have legislation for it have given regulatory forbearance or other concessions in terms of when they actually make it effective. And this is because they realize that VASP has to get up to speed, that the industry has to have the answers. This is something that Pelle's just been talking about, and Patricia too. So there's a huge amount of challenges around this asynchronicity. between implementations in different countries. So within those 4,000 permutations, you end up with some biting and some not at any particular given point in time. In 5 to 10 years, all countries will be implementing it. But by that time, the rules will be rewritten anyway. You've heard that from me here today. My crystal ball.
It'll be in the headlines tomorrow, I'm sure. Thank you.
In the headlines, but by the time you find out in 5 to 10 years, I will have been retired 9.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Siân, for those answers. Daniel raised an interesting point about the protocol and the handshake that might lead to assets that had been transferred being transferred back in the event that they should not go through and be dispersed to the beneficiary. And should it end up with a VASP, back with the originating VASP, it would be difficult to distinguish between that and the assets that were returned and the assets that might be in the hot wallet for that VASP. So one of the areas of complexity in that same scenario where you have a transfer of value, perhaps without the corresponding transfer of information from a non-travel rule compliant VASP. Thank you, Daniel, for that. There was a question from Gitanjali, which was about whether we could elaborate on the requirement that the VASPs are required to be on a global list of VASP entities. I open it to the panelists. Does anybody wish to answer this?
Well, for once, I can probably give a very short answer. There's no requirement for VASPs to be on a global list of VASPs. However, it's absolutely, and I think Pelle has made this point already, it's absolutely essential that in order to comply with one's counterpart VASP due diligence, that you have to be able to ascertain verified information about whether or not that VASP at the other side is duly licensed or registered in its jurisdiction, that it's authorized to do business as a VASP in the other jurisdiction, and therefore make a decision, albeit a risk-based decision, on whether or not to give effect to that transfer. But per se, there's no requirement to appear on a global list of VASPs. It's a practical solution. And the VASPnet database now has some 30,000 entities around the world from only 40 odd countries or thereabouts that currently have lists of folks who are service providers authorized to undertake virtual asset active VASP activities. So you can imagine what that number will eventually be when all countries have implemented these regimes.
Terrific. Pelle, Patricia, is there anything you'd like to add to that question or to that answer? No?
Just reiterate, it's really important to take a risk-based approach here and look at your own business, look at your counterparties, and have that be what guides you in here. Not look at, if you're based in Southeast Asia, you'll have a very different set of counterparties than Patricia does at Bitso, for example, right? And you have to look at the counterparties that are important for you and for your region, for your market, and go in and use the tools that you have. The great thing about using VASPnet and our integration is that it can help you automate a large part of the due diligence aspect, if it fits your risk profile to do so, risk appetite to do so. And that allows you to spend more time on the cases where you go in and apply your own knowledge of your counterparties and go in and perform your own direct due diligence.
Fantastic. Pelle, thank you. Patricia, Siân, thank you both very much. It's really been a pleasure to moderate this panel, and I look forward to the second episode. I have nothing further, so why don't we wrap up?
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.